Wow. Oh, good. Hello, everybody. 4 o'clock on the dot. And the final be easier questions. Sophia, you're going to do fine. Don't worry about it. I don't try to make questions hard. It all depends on if you know the material or not. If you know the material very well, then the exam is going to be a piece of cake. You don't. Why do you think the questions are hard? They're very specific. Right. So that's the point, to evaluate if you study. This is for you. It's not for me. The grades, the exam, the studying, I'm just here to try to make you study and learn. The evaluation is for you to know if you're prepared to go on. I promise I don't try to make questions hard, but I want to make sure that I'm evaluating the students and their knowledge. It's for your benefit. If I would make everything so easy, then what's the point? Have to be challenged. Anyway, just think about what you've learned so far from, well, August doesn't count, that's just 2 lectures. September, October, November, I think you've learned a lot. Like your brain has so many new synapses. So, so far we only have 5% of the class attending the lectures. I guess with the notes and the slides. Anyway, I'm glad someone is here to listen to me. Why do you think more of your colleagues don't attend classes? Am I very boring? Is it very, I don't know. I don't know how to make it more exciting. I try making amazing slides. I don't know. Any suggestions, or how can I make more students attend class? Yes, everybody's very busy. Ah, right. Adding participation. Right. You just want to get more points easy in an easy way. That's not my cup of tea. Maybe in person. Right. Giving extra credit, giving easy points. That's not why I'm here. Ask more questions in class, like during, because there's a certain amount of material, right? That I have to ask, that you have to learn. So I have to balance, because if I say, okay, everything that's in the lecture and everything that's on the notes and slides is going to be covered on the exam. So that therefore we're just going to, during lecture, ask questions and have a dialogue. I don't know. Could we have a dialogue without you studying? I don't think so. So yeah, most people watch the lecture recording. Okay, but that's an option. But then you cannot ask me questions, right? You're just watching. So it's even less active than if you are participating in the class. I like that students participate in the class and ask questions. I think the lectures are very good. I just think many people learn better in a different way. Use flashcards to study. Okay. It's an option. That's why this is college. And I don't take attendance for the lecture because I give out the material. Whoever wants to participate, I'm here. Okay, how many do we have now? Not that many. Well, I can see because I know how many people look at the recordings. Because on the YouTube, I can tell how many have looked at the recordings, and I know that there's lots. 400 or more look at the recordings. But I would think that it would be more fun to be in the class and be able to ask questions and so on. But it's up to each person. We're all so busy. Okay, so today we're going to talk about the spinal cord. Dedicate a whole hour and 15 minutes to the spinal cord. And the spinal cord is part of the CNS, right? It's protected by the vertebral column. So it's very soft material. It has many protections, one of them being the vertebral cortex. And you see that from the spinal cord, you have a lot of spinal nerves that come, that are associated, I should say, with the spinal cord. So you can think about the spinal cord and the spinal nerves as highways that bring information from the periphery, from outside the environment, and also the inside environment. Never forget that we have changes, we have sensations, stimuli being generated in the outside environment, but also very importantly, in the inside environment. So those highways will bring information from the receptors to the spinal cord. From the spinal cord, if it's not a reflex, that those action potentials will travel up to the brain. From the brain, they'll travel down again through the spinal cord and go out to the periphery to activate the receptors. So this is sort of a circuit that initiates at the periphery by activation of receptors. And those action potentials, remember, if the depolarization is strong enough to reach threshold, those minus 55 millivolts, then you have an action potential being initiated at the sensory neuron, and the action potential is conducted to the spinal cord. This is what is shown here, a piece of the spinal cord. And remember, what are nerves? Nerves are the processes that bring, so the axons, let's say, that bring the action potentials towards the spinal cord. But not only that, but I will explain in a little bit. So let me now continue to explain the conduction of the action potential from the receptors. So you have the sensory neuron that brings action potential to the spinal cord. Okay, if it's a reflex, at the spinal cord, you have the generation of a response that is going to go right out without going up to the brain. It's going to go right out. So the motor neuron is going to conduct that action potential to muscles or glands, which are the effectors. So right away, you see that nerves are mixed because the spinal nerves are mixed nerves. Why? Because they contain the sensory neuron and the motor neuron. So they contain the processes from the sensory neuron and motor neuron that come together to form a nerve. Okay, now, if the action potential is such that it has to go up to the brain, then you have the axons that travel from the spinal cord all the way up to the brain. And those are known as tracks. So they bring the action potential to the brain, and they conduct the action potential from the brain back down to the spinal cord. So the difference here is nerves bring the information to the CNS and out to the periphery, and tracks bring the information, I mean action potentials, from the spinal cord up to the brain and down back to the spinal cord. So nerves and tracks, that's the big difference. So the spinal cord just carries the impulse to the top, to the effectors, or from the receptors. So the spinal cord just carries the impulse to the effectors or from the receptors. So the spinal cord, remember, has a white matter and the gray matter. So the spinal cord is part of the central nervous system. So it receives information from the periphery and conveys information to the periphery, but also brings information to the brain and receives information from the brain. So it gets action potentials from the periphery and from the brain. Right. Okay, so let's look at the spinal cord and its protection. So the brain and the spinal cord are very important parts of our body, and they're highly protected, not only by bone, also by connective tissue. And in addition, they have their own fluid, which is the cerebrospinal fluid. So the brain and the spinal cord receive nutrients from the blood vessels, right, from the blood, but also from the CSF, cerebrospinal fluid. Cerebral from the brain, spinal from the spinal cord. So this fluid goes through canal and ventricles in the brain and the central canal in the spinal cord. This is where the fluid, the spinal cord flows through. So what are the layers that protect the spinal cord? So you see here the spinal cord in the middle with the white matter that contains mostly the myelinated axons. Remember, dendrites are not myelinated. And the gray matter contains the cell bodies and unmyelinated processes in the interneurons, right? So here you see the bone, the vertebra that protects the spinal cord. Then we also have meninges. So meninges are made up of connective tissue, and there's 3 layers of meninges. And these meninges, which are membranes that surround the spinal cord and the brain in continuous fashion, and there's 3 of them: dura mater, arachnoid, and pia mater. So dura mater is the one that's more exterior, the one that's closer to the bone. So this is the bone, the vertebral bone. Then you have the dura mater, which is a layer of connective tissue that is close to the bone. Then the middle connective tissue layer is known as the arachnoid. Arachnoid means spider. It's a Latin name for spider. And why do we call this membrane arachnoid? Because it has these projections that make it look like spider legs. So that's the arachnoid. And then you have the most interior layer of connective tissue that's known as the pia mater. So the pia mater is the one that hugs the spinal cord, hugs the white matter of the spinal cord. So in between each of these meninges, each of these membranes, there are spaces, and the spaces can be filled with interstitial fluid or the cerebrospinal fluid, and I will explain this soon. Okay, what else? So we talked about the bone, we talked about these 3 layers of connective tissue, and then you also have the vertebral ligaments that are represented here that also serve as protection to the spinal cord. And then we have the cerebrospinal fluid. So that means that the brain is sort of, and the spinal cord are sort of, the brain is swimming in this cerebrospinal fluid, and the cerebrospinal fluid in the spinal cord flows through the central canal. And this cerebrospinal fluid is generated by the ependymal cells. Remember, the ependymal cells are a type of glia cells. And these are present only in the CNS, in the central nervous system. So these protections also are present in the brain, except instead of the vertebral column, we have the cranium. That makes up choroid plexus. Yes, at the choroid plexus, there are areas in the brain where there's no blood-brain barrier and where the ependymal cells are located. We'll go there soon. Okay, so let's look at greater detail to these different layers of protection of the spinal cord, which make it very interesting. So here's the brain, the bone from the vertebral column, and here is the first membrane. Let's see. The dura mater, right, is here represented in white. And you see there's a space between the bone and the dura mater. This space is filled with fat, with adipocytes, and it's known as the epidural space. So this is very useful because it forms a cushion, right? So that means that the dura mater is not in close contact with the bone. There's a layer, this space, the epidural space, that contains adipocytes. It's like a sponge there, protecting the dura mater. Then between the dura mater and the between the dura mater and the arachnoid matter, this here in blue, this is the arachnoid matter. You see what this process is? That's why it's called arachnoid. It looks like a spider leg. So you have this space here. It's known as the subdural space. The subdural space is filled with interstitial fluid. Remember, interstitial fluid is the fluid that bathes cells. So this is the interstitial fluid. Now, between the arachnoid matter and the pia mater, so the pia mater is very thin, contains blood vessels and so on, and is hugging the spinal cord. So you have this space here. This space is filled with cerebrospinal fluid. So between the pia mater and the arachnoid, you have the cerebrospinal fluid that is flowing. So it's not, although there is no organ dedicated to pulsating the cerebrospinal fluid, it still moves around because we move around, we're not static. And actually, there are some massages that you can use to make the cerebrospinal fluid move in more move it in a better way or in a more optimal fashion. Okay, so so we have all these different layers. So epidural space is filled with adipose tissue. Then we have the dura mater that's made up of irregular connective tissue. Then we have the subdural space between dura mater and arachnoid, filled with interstitial fluid. Then we have the pia mater and the space between the arachnoid and pia mater filled with CSF. So highly, highly protected. Now, we can use these spaces for as diagnostics tools or for delivering medicine. So the first one that I want to present to you is the epidural injections. So the epidural space, remember, is this space between the vertebral column and the dura mater. So during pregnancy, during delivery, some women require or ask for anesthesia and for pain reliever. So then there's an injection that is given and the anesthetic is delivered to the epidural space. So this has to be done very, very carefully because you don't want to have the needle come through the dura mater and maybe reach the spinal cord. That could be very, very damaging. So that means that the woman has to be very, very still. And the syringe is introduced into the epidural space. And then a local anesthetic is given, sometimes also with a pain reliever, like Tylenol or an opioid sometimes. So this space, the epidural space, can be used to deliver anesthesia during certain conditions, such as delivering a baby. Okay, now the arachnoid space. Remember, the arachnoid space is between, I should say subarachnoid space, because it's between the arachnoid and the pia mater. Okay, question. Doesn't the spinal cord end higher up than when the epidural is injected? No. No. The epidural is usually given at the lumbar area. See, lumbar vertebra. That's where it is delivered. Okay, also, you can take a sample of CSF, of cerebrospinal fluid, and this is known as a spinal tap. So you really have to be even more careful because now you go into a layer that is even closer to the spinal cord, right here. So you're taking a sample of cerebral spinal fluid. Yes, spinal block and epidural, same thing. Okay, so in the lab, we learned that the spinal cord ends around L2, I think, and the epidural is injected between L4 and L5. Yes, okay, so let's see here. So we have 31 pairs of spinal nerves, and the spinal cord starts at the medulla and ends as the first lumbar vertebra. Okay, so that's correct. Around lumbar 2, L2. Okay, so the reason why it's too late for some women to do an epidural while in labor is because they won't be able to stay still. Exactly. That happened to me. I have 2 children and I never had any anesthesia because I couldn't stay still. Exactly. You got it, Ilana. If you can't stay still, you cannot get an epidural. Okay, now we move on to the spinal tap. So now what the purpose is to remove a sample of CSF, the cerebral spinal fluid, to see if there's any microorganisms that are in there, or the spinal tap can be used also to deliver antibiotics if there's an infection. A dye, an opaque dye, we want to take if there's a need to take an X-ray of the spinal cord. This is known as myelography. So you're injecting an opaque dye that will allow the imaging of the spinal cord. And then treat, for example, for cancer or something, so to deliver chemotherapeutic agents. So the spinal tap is very useful also. And the person has to lie down on the side, and you see how a needle is inserted into the subarachnoid space, and a sample of spinal fluid can be taken out or can deliver antibiotics or the dye or chemotherapeutic agents. And the person has to stay still for some time after the spinal tap so that there is no danger of leaking of the spinal fluid. Okay, good. Let's see. Waiting room. Okay, so enough. You can now get the idea that the spinal cord is highly protective and that these spaces are very useful either to deliver chemicals or to get samples, for example, from the cerebral spinal fluid. Okay, now let's look at the spinal cord itself. So here is a cross section, and you see that it has this sort of H-like appearance with 2 fissures, one on each side. The dorsal means that it's facing the back. The ventral means it's facing the front, the tummy. And so you have the white on the outside and the gray in the middle with the cell bodies, dendrites. Remember, the dendrites are not myelinated, and axon terminals that are unmyelinated, and also the neuroglia. Does the subdural space have interstitial fluid? So the subdural space has adipocytes. The interstitial fluid is in the subdural space. Okay, so you see here that in the middle of the gray matter of this H-like formation, there's a canal, an opening, which goes all along the spinal cord, and that's the central canal where the CSF is located. What is aggregations? Where do you see aggregations? There's all kinds of aggregations. Just to talk about aggregations is very general. Oh, aggregations of myelinated processes. So aggregations means, you get so bundles. Aggregations means bundles of myelinated processes. Okay? That's another word. Okay, so here you see the brain and the spinal cord, and there are 31 pairs of spinal nerves. Now, these spinal nerves connect the spinal cord with all different areas throughout the brain, throughout the body. And they innervate specific sections of the skin in the body. So each pair of spinal nerve will be dedicated to a particular area of the skin. And there are all these parallel, they're known as dermatomes. So you see here that the skin is divided into all these sections. And each of these sections, L3, L2, L1, T11, corresponds to a pair of spinal nerves. And the dermatomes, which are these areas of the skin that are innervated by a specific pair of spinal nerves, are very useful to determine if there's a problem with a particular pair of spinal nerve. Why? Because you can scratch an area of the skin, and if there is no response, if there's no feeling in that specific dermatome, that means that spinal nerve probably is damaged. So dermatomes are very useful for diagnosis. So what are dermatomes? So they're specific regions of the skin that are innervated by a specific pair of spinal nerve. So they're very clinically important to determine if there's a problem with a specific spinal nerve. Okay, now let's see how the signal that is generated at the periphery, how does it reach the spinal cord, and how does that signal now is delivered to the periphery. Okay, so here we have the skin, and let's say this is a Pacinian corpuscle. Remember, the Pacinian corpuscle is a receptor for pressure at the skin. So let's say you pressure the skin, you touch the skin with strength, the Pacinian corpuscle is activated to a level that reaches threshold, and now you have the action potential traveling down the sensory neuron. And here we have a blood vessel. So not only the skin is the blood vessel with the sensory neuron, the cell body in the ganglion And now we have, so the ganglion, the cell bodies of the sensory neurons, the ganglia are in the ventral root of the spinal cord. This is the dorsal root. So the sensory is always at the dorsal root. Sorry, this is in the back. So it comes into the spinal cord. So this is the back of the spinal cord, towards the back, where the sensory information travels to. And then you can have here interneurons that are very hard to see. They are sort of yellowish. So the action potential now, the interneurons synapse with the motor neurons. And this information, the motor neurons now go through, face the ventral portion of the spinal cord. So this would be the anterior root. The dorsal root is also known as the posterior root. The back faces the back. The anterior root, which carries the motor neurons, they face the ventral, the front of the body. So you see the motor neuron now coming out of the spinal cord and carrying the action potential to the effectors. So the effectors can be muscles. Here you have a skeletal muscle, can be smooth muscle, cardiac muscle, or glands. So now you see here anatomically how this network of neurons are connected to each other. And what we're missing here is the neurons that would bring the information up to the brain, and that would be by the tracts. So we just see from the periphery to the spinal cord, and from the spinal cord out to the periphery. So you can see here this area. This represents a nerve, a spinal nerve. That's why we say the spinal nerve are mixed nerves. Why? Because each spinal nerve carries a sensory and a motor neuron. The tracts that carry the information from the spinal cord up to the brain and down to the brain and down to the spinal cord, some are mixed and some are mostly sensory, some are mostly motor. So, but the spinal nerves, they're always mixed nerves. Okay, so we talked about the dermatomes. And now, what are the functions of the spinal cord? So the white matter, this is to conduct the nerve impulse. So it brings information from the periphery, the sensory, ascending tracts. So it comes from the periphery. Now, the action potentials that reach the spinal cord, now they can go up to the brain through the ascending tracts. So now we're not talking anymore about nerves. We're talking about tracts because these fibers are going along the spinal cord to the brain. So they're known now as tracts. Then the motor neurons will come from the brain, go from the brain down the spinal cord and then to the periphery. And these would be the descending tracts, bringing the action potential from the brain down the spinal cord. So these are myelinated axons and sensory and motor neurons. There's some that are unmyelinated. But here, so the take-home message here is that the spinal cord is a way of conducting action potentials from the periphery to the brain and from the brain down the spinal cord and then out to the periphery. Okay, so the gray matter here, what is its function? It will interpret, it will integrate the information that comes from the periphery, goes to the brain, comes down, and then goes out to the periphery. So you have there the cell bodies of the motor neurons, you have the interneurons, and you have neuroglia also. And then the spinal cord, in a way, regulates locomotion because it coordinates the information that comes from the brain and different areas of the brain, also the cerebellum, to control the movement of the muscles in the limbs. And it's also the center of reflexes. Remember, these are very short networks that never make it to the brain. They're just specific to the spinal cord. So you have conduction, you have integration, locomotion, because it controls the movement by activating the muscles, and also involved in reflexes. Okay, so here again, what is interesting here now, the additional information, is that we're looking at the areas in the brain where the information, the sensory information that comes from the periphery, where are the action potentials, where are those nerve impulses going to be conducted? So they're going to be conducted to this area, which is the sensory cortex. So whatever you feel in your limbs, in the skin, and so on, those action potentials are going to be conducted to this very specific area in the brain. That's the sensory cortex. It's represented here in green, and it's located in the parietal lobe of the brain. So whatever information comes from the periphery, from the skin and the limbs, is not going to stop in any specific area of the brain. It's going to be conducted to the sensory cortex. And you see that right next to the sensory cortex is the motor cortex, here shown in red. And this now is in the frontal cortex. So you have the parietal lobe and the frontal lobe next to each other, and you have these two regions very close. So there's like a slice in the brain that receive information from the periphery. So you have the action potential reaching the sensory cortex, then it travels to the motor cortex right next to it, and through the motor neuron, it comes down and goes out to the periphery. So what I'm showing here is the ascending tracks that carry the sensory information, and the descending tracks in red that carry information from the brain down, that then is going to be conveyed to the periphery. So remember, the nerves contain the sensory and motor neurons that go to the periphery. The tracks contain the sensory and motor neurons that bring the information along the spinal cord to the brain and down the spinal cord. So you see here the highways. You go north to the brain, south to the brain, this would be the tracks, and then out to the periphery, and from the periphery, this would be the nerves. So you have different highways, different processes, fibers that go from the periphery to the spinal cord to the brain. So the spinal cord has sensory, integrative, and motor functions. So it receives the information coming from the periphery, it interprets that information, integrates, and brings it up to the brain if necessary, and then transmits to the periphery, out to the periphery, to the effectors, to the motor output. Okay, so three terms that are used to this generation of action potentials by the receptors at the periphery. So one term is sensation. What is sensation? So the sensation is what is generated by stimuli. So it's perceived by the receptors. So you have receptors inside the body and receptors outside the body. And some stimuli you are aware of, So you are aware of a change in light or a change in sound. So those are sensations that are conscious. You are conscious on those changes originated by stimuli. But some can be unconscious. You don't know that there's a change in blood pressure unless you are measuring. You don't know if there's a change in oxygen, carbon dioxide. So those are unconscious sensations that are generated by different stimuli. So that's a sensation. It's generated by stimuli, by activation of receptors. Then the perception. The perception is that something has changed. So you are aware and you interpret. So if you close your eyes and there's wind going by, you know that there's a change in pressure in the outside environment. So that's a perception because we have receptors that are activated. But we don't perceive all changes, all sensations are not perceived. Then you have modality. So what's the modality? Is the ability to distinguish one sensation from another. And how is that possible? That is possible because each sensory neuron carries one particular type of sensation. So you have one sensory neuron that carries the action potential generated, for example, by activation of a photoreceptor. Then you would have another sensory neuron that is activated by a change in sound. So how can we distinguish the different types of sensations? Is because there are different sensory neurons. So you have a one-to-one relationship almost between a receptor and a sensory neuron. So each sensory neuron will be activated by a specific type of receptor. Let's see, there's been here. I don't understand the difference between nerve and track. Well, nerves are here bringing the action potentials from the receptors to the spinal cord. The fibers themselves, those are nerves. And then those fibers that bring the action potentials to the brain and down from the brain to the spinal cord, those are tracks. Where is the white and gray matter located? Oh, I'm going in the wrong direction. Here is the gray matter in the middle of the spinal cord and the white matter on the outside. So when you say periphery, you mean spinal cord? No. When I say periphery, I mean outside of the spinal cord. Remember, the spinal cord is part of the central nervous system. So periphery is where the receptors and the effectors are. So where the receptors, all kinds of receptors, like the eye, the ear, touch, and so on, and where the effectors are, the muscles and the glands, that's the periphery, outside of the central nervous system. So can you explain the difference between a conscious sensation and perception? They sound very similar. They are. The difference is that sensations can be conscious or unconscious. So there are some sensations that you don't perceive, you don't understand, you don't feel it, you don't know. You feel it, but you don't know that, you don't feel it, you don't know that it's happening. So let's say if there's a change in carbon dioxide inside the body, right? That's a sensation. It's going to activate specific receptors, but you don't know that that's happening. It's still a sensation. It's still generated by a stimulus, but you cannot perceive it. However, the sensations that are conscious like changes in lights, changes in in sound and so on, then you are aware of them. So that's perception. So perception is the awareness of a sensation. But there are sensations where there's no perception. So you understand the difference, I hope. So sensations is more general. Some are conscious, some are unconscious. Perception is dedicated to the sensations that are conscious. And modality is what allows us to distinguish. Because remember, any sensation, any stimulus that activates an action potential, now it's going to be an electrical impulse. So we no longer know that if it's coming from the light, if it's coming from the sound, if it's coming from a change in temperature, because it's all converted into an electrical impulse. So how can we distinguish? That's the modality property, because we have one sensory neuron that is dedicated, for example, is to a photoreceptor. So that means that sensation, that information is going to be brought by that sensory neuron, that electrical impulse is going to end up in the occipital lobe where the vision is. So that modality is what allows us to distinguish from one type of sensation to another. Okay. Okay, so receptors, we've been talking about receptors. So there's many different types of receptors. Nociceptors, these receptors are pain receptors. And you might think, horrible, why do we have pain receptors? So you know that there's some individuals that can be born without pain receptors in specific areas. And this is very dangerous because you can be doing something that is damaging and you're not aware because you don't have the pain receptor. So pain receptors are essential for maintaining homeostasis and for safe life. So nociceptors are pain receptors. Thermoreceptors are, the name indicates, temperature receptors. These are on the skin. The cold receptors are deeper than the receptors for heat. Mechanoreceptors respond to changes in pressure. So remember Merkel, Pacinian, and so on. Also, the auditory receptors or mechanoreceptors. Chemoreceptors, they respond to changes in chemicals, such as, for example, changes in oxygen levels in the blood or carbon dioxide or glucose and things like this. Photoreceptors in the retina respond to photons. Osmoreceptors respond to changes in pressure. In molarity, sorry. These osmoreceptors are involved in giving us the sensation of thirst. So osmoreceptors, they bring the information, the action potential goes to the hypothalamus. Would pain from heat, like a burn, be both thermo and nociceptor? Would pain, okay, let's see. Would pain from heat, like a burn, be both thermo and nociceptors? Exactly. So the nociceptors would be for pain, but the thermoreceptors will be for the change in heat. So you would have to have both receptors being activated, because you could have thermoreceptors and you might not feel the pain if the change in temperature is not strong enough to activate the pain receptor, right? So there are two different receptors. You have the receptors for pain and you have the receptors for temperature. but the same sensation can activate both types of receptors, the same stimulus. Okay, now let's talk about the ascending and descending tracts. Remember what this is, the ascending and descending tracts. So these are the fibers, the nerve fibers. They're actually nerve fibers, tracts that go up and down. They're located in the spinal cord. So you have the sensory and motor fibers that are present in the spinal nerve and these in the spinal cord, and these are called tracts. So let's see, what are these tracts? What do they involve? So you have the sensory neuron that comes from the receptor all the way to the spinal cord. This we call the first order neuron. So you have one whole neuron that comes from the receptor to the spinal cord, or it can go directly to the brain stem, to the medulla. So you see here, this first order neuron, the cell body is outside the spinal cord in the ganglia. So this would be the first neuron. And now it synapses at the spinal cord with another sensory neuron. So remember now, up to now, we just focused on going into the spinal cord and coming out. But now we're going to continue that action potential is going to go up to the brain. So what are the neurons that are now carrying that action potential all the way to the brain? So now we have a second order neuron that goes from the spinal cord or brain stem to the thalamus. So now we are already in the brain, right? So we go a level higher. We go from the spinal cord to the brain. So this is the second order neuron. So we already have one synapse here. And now we have the second order neuron that brings the action potential from the spinal cord to the thalamus. Remember, the olfactory sensation does not go to the thalamus. It goes to the olfactory bulb directly without going through the thalamus. So it skips the second order neuron. Now you have a second order neuron, and then you have another synapse at the thalamus, and leading to the third order neuron. So the third order neuron carries the action potential from the thalamus to the cerebral cortex, that area that I showed you here, the sensory cortex. So we're going from first order. So if you concentrate on the blue, you have first order neuron synapsing at the spinal cord, the second order neuron going to the thalamus, and then synapsing at the thalamus and going to the sensory cortex. So that's the ascending track. Now, at the cerebral cortex, you have here an interneuron that is going to carry that action potential to the motor cortex. So remember, now we're going from this green area to the red area, the motor cortex. So you have interneurons. So an interneuron, integration by interneuron, that's what integration means. And now going from the cerebral cortex down to the spinal cord, that would be the down track, the descending track. But now instead of having 3 neurons, 2 synapses, we just have one synapse. We have an upper motor neuron that goes from the cerebral cortex to the spinal cord. Just one long neuron, one descending track that at the spinal cord, it synapses with the motor neuron, the lower motor neuron. So you just have 2. The descending track only has 2 neurons, the upper motor neuron coming from the cerebral cortex to the spinal cord, and then the lower motor neuron going from the spinal cord to the muscle or gland. So up to now, we only focused on this area. Now we're going focusing on the tracks. Where is that sensation, that impulse? How is it carried up to the brain and down to the spinal, back down to the spinal cord? So going up, you have 3 neurons. First order, second order, third order. Going down, you have 2 neurons. Upper motor neuron and lower motor neuron. Okay, so if we focus now on these ascending tracks, there's basically 4 of them. The cuneate gracili fasciculi. This ascending track, so we're talking about this one, so brings the action potentials from the medulla, the brain stem. So here, there's no spinal cord. It goes directly. That means that the sensory receptor goes right to the medulla, bypassing the spinal cord. From the medulla to the thalamus and then to the cerebral cortex. So this is the cuneate gracili fasciculi. The cuneate nucleus and the gracile nucleus are located in the medulla. So what kind of sensations follow this ascending track? Vibration, pain, deep touch, proprioception. What's proprioception? Proprioception is the perception. Now here you have the perception of if you're standing, if you're sitting, if you're bending. So body position. That is given by proprioceptors. So non-visual sense of body position. So that's the one type of ascending track that does not go through the spinal cord. My gosh, I'm going so slow here. Then we have the spinal thalamic tract. That goes from the spinal cord to the thalamus to the cerebral cortex. So what types of sensations follow or go through this tract? Pain, heat, cold, and so on. Then the spinal reticular tract goes from the spinal cord to the reticulum, which is an area in the brain, then to the thalamus and cerebral cortex. And then the spinal cerebellum goes to the cerebellum. So you see how these sensations, these sensory neurons go from one area to a specific area within the brain. Okay, so here you have an example showing, let's go here to the spinal thalamic tract. So you have the first order neuron for pain, pressure, and so on. You see here in red, that's the first order neuron. The synapse is at the spinal cord. Then you have the second order neuron going up the spinal cord to the thalamus, and then going from the thalamus to the cerebral cortex. So that's one example of the spinal thalamic tract. Let's talk about pain. We've been talking about pain. So the area in the brain that is dedicated to receiving impulses from pain receptors is located in the parietal lobe. So you come all the way, the receptors, when they're activated, then they bring first, second, third order, all the way to the cerebral cortex, to the parietal lobe. So there's different types of pain. There's referred pain. This is a very interesting type of pain, which tells us if there's an organ, if there's damage in an organ. So the pain receptors would be located in one of our internal organs, in the viscera. So how do we know which of our organs, inside organs, are being damaged? Well, there's something called referred pain. That means we would feel pain in a specific area of the body. For example, if there's a problem with the heart, which area of the body are we going to feel pain? We don't feel pain in the heart per se, but this area on the left side of the body and down the left arm, if we have pain located here, and there's no pain in skeletal muscle, right? We're talking about smooth muscle and cardio muscle. So if there's a problem with these cardio smooth muscle, in this case, the cardio myocytes, we feel pain at the in the left side and along the arm. What if there's some problem with the liver and gallbladder? This is where we feel pain, referred pain. So it's pain that refers to a specific organ. This will let us know that there's a problem with one of our internal organs. And it's reflected on the body, on the outside surface of the body. Okay, so do all the ascending tracks go through first, second, third order? Yes. Except for the olfactory. Remember, olfactory you only have two because it goes directly. It doesn't go to the thalamus. There's another type of pain which is known as phantom pain. And this phantom pain is perceived in a limb that has been amputated. So how can you feel pain if the limb is not there? So what happens is that part of the sensory neuron that is still intact can be activated. And if it's activated, the body has the area of the brain has no way of knowing that the limb is not there because you have the electrical impulse is being activated and carried to the pain center. So you feel pain, although the limb is not there, because the remaining section or peripheral part of the sensory neuron is intact. So it can be activated and it will carry that information to the pain center. So although the limb is not there, the intact portion of that sensory neuron is activated and it's carried to the pain center and gives you the feeling of having pain in that amputated limb without it being there. This also happens, for example, in mastectomy. When breasts are removed, the women can feel pain, although the breasts are not there. Why? Because the section of the sensory neuron that is closer to the pain center is still intact. Okay, so to relieve pain, we use anesthesia. So there's anesthesia and there's analgesia. What is the difference between anesthesia and analgesia? Anesthesia means that the areas in the central nervous system or local, the impulses are being stopped. They cannot be transported. They're not being propagated. That's what anesthesia means. So you stop the conduction of the pain action, the action potentials generated by pain. So it can be general anesthesia. So it alters the conduction, the propagation of the action potentials to the central nervous system, or it can be local, like when you go to the dentist, right? The Novocaine. So that's a type of anesthesia. You block the conduction of the action potential. What is the difference? What is analgesia? Analgesia, you stop the perception. Remember, perception of pain. The pain can still be conducted. You haven't stopped the propagation of the action potential. You just stopping the perception of pain. And how do you do that? With narcotics, which are opioids, and they're very, very strong and can lead to addiction. Or non-narcotics, like the NSAIDs, like Tylenol, and so on, and so on. So they prevent the stimulation of the pain receptors. So that's the difference. Anesthesia, you block the Would non-narcotics be used for phantom pain? Yes. Yep. Okay. So now the motor neurons, the descending tracts. So the biggest, the longest descending tract, so now we bring in the action potentials, the nerve impulses from the brain down to the spinal cord. So these, the longest one are the pyramidal pathways. So these are the cortical spinal pathways. Remember, we only have two motor neurons. The upper motor neuron that comes from the cerebral cortex all the way down through the medulla to the spinal cord. At the medulla, it crosses over to the other side. So this means, for example, that the right side of the brain controls the left side of the body. Why? Because this cortical spinal pathway, this upper motor neuron, crosses over to the other side at the medulla. This is known as the decussation of the pyramid. So what's the pyramid? The pyramid is this very long upper motor neuron that now is going to synapse with the lower motor neuron that brings the impulse down out to the muscle. Okay, so this is the longest pathway, cortical spinal pathway, going from the motor cortex all the way to the spinal cord. And this pyramid, this very long upper motor neuron, crosses over at the medulla. So myelination, we already talked about this. And the descending pathways, there's the pyramidal cortical spinal pathway, but there are others that are extrapyramidal pathways that carry information to other areas. The cerebrospinal tract is almost non-existent in humans. Tectospinal, this brings the action, the motor action potential to the head. Tectospinal, tecto, head. Vestibulospinal involves balance and head position, and then reticulospinal tracts, limb posture and balance. So these are the tracts that bring the action potentials from the cerebral, from the cortex down to the spinal cord. Okay, and here you see these tracts shown here. Okay, now we go on to the reflex arc. So this is the simplest kind of network, where you have one sensory neuron going to the spinal cord, and then over here you can have some synapses. Then you have the motor neuron going out to the effector. So this is the reflex. That means you don't have any tracts involved. Here you only have nerves involved. The motor, the sensory neuron and the motor neuron meet here in a bundle, form a bundle that's part of the nerve. So what are the components of the reflex arc? Well, we talked about this many times. You have the receptor at the periphery, and the sensory neuron coming to the spinal cord. Here you have an interneuron that allows the electrical impulse to travel to the other side or also up to the brain. And then you have the motor neuron and you have the effector. So there's 5 components: receptor, sensory neuron, then the integrating center, which is in the spinal cord, the motor neuron, and the effector, which is the muscle. Okay, so referring to the skeletal muscle, so when the electrical impulse now is going to be conducted to skeletal muscle, we're not talking about smooth of cardiac muscle. We're talking just the reflexes that involve skeletal muscle. So there's 4 different types of reflexes: stretch, tendon, flexor, and cross extension. So these depend on what kind of receptors are involved in activating these reflexes. So the first one, the stretch reflex, the receptor is known as a muscle spindle. What is a muscle spindle? A muscle spindle is a muscle fiber that is modified, differentiated into a stretch receptor. And you see here that it forms like a helix, and it is hidden within the other skeletal muscle fibers. So this muscle spindle, which is a stretch receptor, so it prevents the muscles from overstretching. So when they overstretch, the reflex is activated and you stop stretching that muscle. So this is a stretch receptor that responds to overstretching of the skeletal muscle where the stretch receptor is located. So the stretch reflex is the simplest. We say that it's monosynaptic and it's ipsilateral. What does that mean? So you see here a spindle, right? A muscle spindle, which is the receptor, and it's hidden within the muscle. So it's activated, the muscle, muscle spindle is activated, initiates an action potential. Here's a sensory neuron, and it only synapses, goes through the spinal cord, only synapses directly with a motor neuron. So it's a very quick response that prevents the muscle from overstretching. So you're stretching the muscle, you're activating that muscle. The stretch receptor is activated, and immediately the reflex is to stop activating that muscle. So it's a very quick reflex. It doesn't, the action potential, the electrical impulse does not have to travel to the brain. The response is very fast, almost automatic. So it's monosynaptic because there's only one synapse between the sensory and motor, and ipsilateral because the electrical impulse goes into the spinal cord and comes out on the same side. So here, the right side goes in through the right side and comes out to the right side also. So an example is a patellar reflex. So you see here, notice that we do this. If you go to the doctor, probably the doctor does this, tests your patellar reflex. So it hits here, and you see that there's an automatic response to this pinching here. So this involves just one sensory neuron synapsing at the spinal cord with one motor neuron. So it's the nature reflex. So this is the simplest type of reflex. The other types of reflexes associated with skeletal muscle are known as polysynaptic reflex. Why? Polysynaptic, because there's more than one synapse involved. So you see here, there are different types of receptors. It can be pain receptors or tendon organ receptors. So the receptor is activated, and you have the sensory neuron. Oh, it doesn't show. Oh, it comes from here. Sorry. So you have the sensory neuron. Here you can have a pain receptor. So you have a sensory neuron traveling the electrical impulse to the spinal cord, synapses with one interneuron, the interneuron synapses with the motor neuron, and then the electrical impulse goes right out. So this is a reflex. It has two synapses, so it's polysynaptic reflex. So what are some examples of polysynaptic reflexes? So one of them involves a receptor known as the Golgi tendon organ. This Golgi tendon organ is made up of connective tissue and also the endings of sensory neurons. And it's located in the tendon. Send me an email. One that comes in through one side and leaves on the other side is contralateral. We will get there, Sophia. Wait just 1 second. We'll get there. That's a more complex reflex. It's polysynaptic. Okay, now we're talking about the Golgi tendon organ that is a type of receptor located in the tendons, and it also prevents tendons from overstretching and from rupturing. So what happens, you see here, a tendon organ, it's located in the tendon. When it's activated, you have one sensory neuron, and now it synapses at the spinal cord. So it can bring electrical impulse up to the brain, but we're just talking about this circuit, the reflex, without going to the brain. So it synapses now with two different interneurons. One interneuron will synapse with a motor neuron that brings the information to the quadriceps, and that's the agonist. The same time, so this means it's inhibiting this muscle. It's inhibiting the quadriceps, so that the tendon doesn't rupture. But it stimulates the hamstring, which is the antagonist. So all the action of these two muscles, the aim is to prevent the tendon from rupturing. So this is a tendon reflex. So it is, the receptor is a Golgi tendon organ. It's polysynaptic because it involves more than one synapse, but it's still ipsilateral. It's coming in through the spinal cord on the right side, and the electrical stimulus is coming out on the same side. So this controls muscle tension. Now, another reflex, the flexor reflex. Now here, the receptor is a pain receptor. So you see the sensory neuron. Now you have more than one synapse at the spinal cord, and you have stimulation of the flexors. So that's why it's the flexor reflex. The flexors are stimulated to remove the foot from the damaging stimulus. So this is the flexor reflex. It's activated by pain receptors. Now, this is still polysynaptic, ipsilateral, because the electrical stimulus comes through the right side and it goes out to the muscle on the same side. Now we have more complex, the cross extension reflex. And this reflex usually occurs at the same time as the flexor reflex. Why? Because if you move your leg, you want signals to arrive to the other leg so that you don't fall, to give you equilibrium. So that's the cross extensor reflex. So you have the sensory neuron being activated coming to the spinal cord. Here, it synapses with interneurons and motor neurons on the ipsilateral, on the same side that would allow the leg to be removed. This would be the flexor reflex, but the action potential, the electrical current, also travels to the other side, to the opposite side, the contralateral, to send signals to the other leg to provide equilibrium. So this would be the cross extensor reflex, which is polysynaptic, but now it's contralateral. So the flexor is ipsilateral, the extensor is contralateral, and they usually occur side by side, so that you are allowed to remove the leg, but you are also provided with equilibrium. So these are the types of reflexes that control the movement, the skeletal muscle, without requiring the electrical impulse to go to the brain. Okay, so some reflexes can be used as diagnostic tools. So for example, the patellar reflex, why is it that the doctor administers this type of diagnostic test to see if your spinal cord at the lumbar area, if it is in good condition. So the patellar reflex indicates the status of the spinal segments L2 to L5. The Achilles reflex, this indicates if there's a problem with this Achilles reflex, that means that the problem at the spinal cord is at the sacral S1 region. The Binsky sign, this is used to determine the status of the spinal cord and or brain. So what happens is you strike the bottom of the foot. What happens as a reflex, the toes will open up like a fan. That's the Babinski sign. And this is natural in children, but not in human. So if this happens in a human, the normal fanning of the toes can indicate that there's spinal cord injury or brain, or if there's a stroke happening. And finally, the abdominal reflex. So if it's not present, if it's abnormal, this means there's a problem with the cortical spinal tract. So one can test this reflex to determine the status of the spinal cord. Okay. Now here are problems that can affect the spinal cord. So it can lead to paralysis. It can lead, so depending on which area of the spinal cord is being damaged, it can lead to problems with respiration. If it's above the origin of the phrenic nerves, C3, C5, paralysis. You have monoplegia, if it's one limb, diplegia, two limbs, either upper or lower, paraplegia, lower limbs, hemiplegia, half of the body, and quadriplegia, upper and lower, all of them. That's quadriplegia, paralysis. So these terms are related to paralysis. Sciatica, that's a problem with the sciatica nerve. This is the longest nerve in our body, and it can be impinged in different areas and can lead to extreme pain. That's the sciatica. And now shingles. So shingles is caused by a virus, herpes zoster virus. In children, it's known as chickenpox. And sometimes, if it's not cured properly, this virus can stay in the body, in the sensory neurons, in a latent manner. So it's not active, but all of a sudden it can be reactivated. And then it travels down and causes enormous pain that is known as shingles. So shingles is an infection by the herpes zoster virus, but in an adult. So you know how the viruses can travel through retrograde transport, and then it can be, it can stay latent in the ganglia or in the spinal cord, and then it will travel, all of a sudden, it will be reactivated, and it will travel down the nerve and will affect a specific area of the body. So causing this rash. So that's shingles caused by a herpes zoster virus. And this, my final slide, that is represents the problem of amyotrophic lateral sclerosis, or ALS, or Lou Gehrig's disease. Lou Gehrig was a baseball player that suffered from this disease. So this is the degeneration of the motor neurons. So if the motor neurons, you see here that they are myelinated, if they degenerate, then the muscles atrophy. And the last step is the lack of being able to breathe. So Stephen Hawking, who's a very famous physicist, was the longest lived patient with ALS. He survived until the age of 76. So he was sitting on a chair, nothing worked, only his head worked. And but he still was able to survive until the age of 76. So ALS is related to the degeneration of the motor neurons. Okay, done with the spinal cord. They still, yes, ALS patients, yes, they have mental abilities. It does not have to do with cognition. Oh, the virus, the Zooster virus, yes. Does it go in and out on the same side? Yes, because it's using the same sensory neuron. So this would be a sensory neuron. And the virus travels up the sensory neuron, stays latent in the cell body. Then when it reactivates, it goes down the same sensory neuron. So it enters and leaves on the same side because the virus is using the same sensory neuron. It never comes out. It stays lodged in that sensory neuron. Okay, done. So we finished. Any questions? If someone wants to have a Zoom with me, please send me an email and we can set it up. So have a good weekend. Oh, not Thanksgiving yet. See you next Tuesday.
Professor,
Yes.
is there any way I can set that Zoom meeting up today?
Yes. You want to have it right now?
Yes, please,
Okay,
if it's
so let
possible.
everybody leave and then you come on again. Okay?
Okay, so should I stay on the Zoom or should I leave?
No, leave so everybody leaves. I leave also. And then we sign on again.
Okay, okay,
Okay?
thank you.
Sure. Okay. Bye-bye. Have a good weekend, everybody.